verses 7 through 11. Matthew chapter 7, verses 7 through 11. It says, "Ask, and it will be given you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and the one who knocks, it will be opened. Or which one of you, if his son asks for bread, will give him a stone? If he asks for a fish, will give him a serpent? If you then who are evil know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him?" Some people have created a doctrine that is properly expressed like this: name it, claim it, and it's yours. I'm not certain that that is the promise of ask and it will be given to you. In fact, I'm fairly certain that it's not. I'm also sure that it doesn't mean that we're going to get what we want all the time. It is a promise that God will answer and that He will not give us something that isn't good. But that also doesn't mean that everything that happens I'm going to think is a good thing. And it doesn't mean that because I prayed about it and it came to pass that it must be the best circumstances for me. In fact, my parents taught me when I was very young that sometimes the things that I need, the things that are good for me, are not always enjoyable. Good is not synonymous with pleasure. Good doesn't mean that I get my way. Good doesn't mean that I am happy. Good doesn't mean that it's easy. Good doesn't even mean that I think it's right. And sometimes good doesn't mean that it's right. And we'll see that in a moment. We don't get to define what's good. God defines what is good. And I'll also point out that sometimes if God sees instructional value in something, we get what we ask for even if God doesn't really want it for us. And this one is an extremely important lesson. In those cases, we do what we get what we're asking for, but it's really what we deserve, not just because we've asked for it. I want to turn your attention for a little while to the 8th chapter of the book of 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel chapter 8. There is an interesting account about the people of God and their experiences, and there are lessons that I think are timely and are useful for us in connection with what we're looking at here today, and considering the things that we might get from God. The chapter begins that when Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn son was Joel, the name of his second Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. Yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, "Behold, you're old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations." There's a couple of things I want to notice here. The way that the sons of Samuel became judges was somewhat different than the way of all the other judges that Israel had had. If you go back to Judges chapter 2, it said that God raised up judges for the people. And in every case, as far as I know, the one who served as a judge because God told them to take that mantle. That is not what happened here. And I find it very interesting that the text says that Samuel made his sons judges. It does not say that God made Samuel sons judges. It said that Samuel got old. And as sometimes the case when you get old, your body starts to fight against you. And you get pains and aches, and it's hard to do certain things that maybe once weren't all that difficult, and it's trouble to do things that maybe once you were willing to do, and you get tired easy. And doing hard things becomes even more difficult because of these things. And we're told here that Samuel became old. He was aging and he was suffering all of the things that come along with that. And so Samuel decides, apparently, that he is going to give the authority to judge to his sons that had been given to him. Problem was his sons were not good guys. They didn't accept this authority and deal with it properly. They abused their authority. They turned aside after gain. They took bribes. They perverted justice. They did all sorts of things that were wrong. And then the people began to grumble. But particularly it says that the elders of Israel gathered together, and they came to Samuel at Ramah. And they said, "Behold, you're old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king, like all the nations." So what we see is a picture here of the people of God that are turning away from God. And when they were confronted with the unruliness that existed in the nation, unruliness that started from the top down, it's careful to point out. When they got confronted by that unruliness, rather than what had been the pattern all throughout the entire book of Judges, that they turned away from God. This turning away from God thing isn't really all that new. They turned away from God. Difficult times came upon them. They cried out to God for deliverance, and God raised up a judge. But instead of them turning to God, when they are confronted by this unruliness and injustice, they reject God. And they look at the nations around them, and they see these nations with monarchs, and they say, "Give us a king, Samuel." Now, as I suggested to you that Samuel probably didn't have the authority to make his sons judges in Israel, I can assure you he didn't have the authority to give them a king. He understood that. And so look at what it says in verse 6. The thing displeased Samuel. The thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." And Samuel prayed to the Lord. The Lord said to Samuel, "Obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them, according to all the deeds that they have done from the day I brought them forth up out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are also doing to you." Now, not everyone wanted a king. That's kind of an important thing for us to note here. This is not the entire nation who was crying for a king. We're actually only told that the elders were asking for this specifically. I suspect that there were more in the land that supported that idea. We know there was at least Samuel who thought it was a really bad idea. There were probably more that didn't like it. And so there was a division about what ought to be done. Samuel goes to God, which is a good thing. I think sometimes we suggest that Samuel's upset when God says they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. That Samuel was afraid that he was going to lose his influence, but that's not really the case because he'd already given that influence away. They were rejecting God. They were rejecting God's authority. And it wasn't going to bring them the peace and the order that they wanted. Keep that in mind. What they wanted was peace and order. What they had was the two sons of Samuel who were carrying out injustice, who were receiving bribes, who weren't doing right. They wanted relief from that, and they believed, at least some of them, that a king was the way to bring them peace and order. because they looked at the nations around them in the world and they seemed to see better circumstances in those lands, and they said, we want a king to judge us the way that those people have. Because they really wanted justice. They wanted peace. They wanted fairness. They wanted judges who didn't receive bribes. What they asked for wasn't going to bring them what they wanted, but they really believed that it would. What God knew is that it would make things worse. God knew that the situation that they were asking for wasn't actually going to solve their problem or make things better or accomplish any of the tasks that they wanted accomplished. It was actually going to make it worse. And so he does tell Samuel to give them everything that they asked for, but then he tells Samuel to warn them of some things. And let's read together, starting in verse 9, and we're going to read down through verse 18. And take note of the warning. Now then, obey their voice, only you shall solemnly warn them, and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them. So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king for him. He said, these will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He'll take your sons and appoint them to his chariots to be horsemen and to run before his chariots. He will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of fifties, and some to plow his field and to reap his harvest and to make his implements of war and to equip his chariots. He'll take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He'll take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his servants. He'll take the tenth of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and to his servants. He'll take your male servants and female servants, the best of your young men and your donkeys, and put them to his work. He'll take the tenth of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. In that day you'll cry out because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer in that day. So God warned them. God warned them through Samuel the ill effects of what they wanted. God warned them that their children weren't going to grow up to be the artisans and to be the business owners and to be the farmers that they were. It wasn't that they were going to be able to give their businesses and give their farms and their lands to their children to do the things that they did. No, their children were going to be taken by the king and put to work for him. They were going to be taxed. Their sons and daughters were going to be pulled off and put into the service of the king, either in the military or in the artisan shops. They were going to be taxed. They were going to lose the produce of their land to the king and to his servants. They were going to lose the produce of their vineyards to the king and to his servants. They were going to lose a tenth of everything. They were going to lose their male servants and female servants. There was going to be a need for their slaves to be taken away. They were going to lose their donkeys to be pressed in the service of the government. They were going to lose the beast of the field that they used to plow and do the other things that they used to do work for the government. They were going to lose a tenth of all their flocks. He was going to take all of these things. This is what was going to happen. This is how it works. This is what, to some extent, must be. Because if you're going to build a nation like that and have a standing army, you have to equip that standing army with people, and you have to have armament for it, and you have to have chariots, and you have to have guns, and you have to have swords, and you have to have the people to build those things. You have to press them into service. They're going to have to be moved. They're going to have to be taken away from their families. They're not going to be doing the things that they've been doing all of these years and that they've grown accustomed to. Things were going to change. And not change in a way that was for their better, and not change in a way that really accomplished what they wanted, and not do something that was better for them, but something worse. But he was going to give them exactly what they asked for. Now, there's a lesson in that for us, folks. Now, not only is it true that my ways are not God's ways. Not only is it true that the thing that I think is right is not always right. Not only is it true that just because I ask God for it doesn't mean that I am going to get what God would want me to have? That's why you got to be careful to say, if the Lord wills, when you ask for things. You need to really ask for His will to be done. You need to ask for what is right to come to pass. You need to ask for what you need, because sometimes when you ask for the wrong things, He decides that this is a good opportunity to teach you a lesson. And that's what He does with these folks. He warned them through Samuel of all of these ill effects, but you know what? They still wanted what they wanted. And so they were given what they wanted. Look at verse 19. The people refused to obey the voice of Samuel. They didn't listen to the warnings of Samuel. They didn't go back and reflect. They didn't say, hold on, wait a minute. Maybe what we're asking for isn't good. If God told Samuel to say those things to us, maybe we should change what we're asking for. They didn't do that. They refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, but there shall be a king over us. They were adamant that they had the answer. That we may also be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. That's interesting to me as well. They didn't just want a king, they wanted someone to do things for them. I want our king to go out and fight our battles. I don't want to have to do this. When Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the ears of the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, obey their voice, make them a king. Samuel said to the men of Israel, go, every man to his own city. So God gave them this king. It wasn't because He wanted them to have a king. He said at the outset, they're rejecting me. I am their king. I should be the one that they turn to for help. I should be the one that goes before them in battle. I should be the one that they put their confidence and trust in. They're rejecting me. And so God didn't want this for the people. And He didn't even seem to think it was a good idea, because He understood that it was only going to cause more problems, more difficulties, and more hardships. And so it wasn't what He wanted, and it wasn't that He thought it was good in an absolute sense. It was because He thought it was good for them. He thought it was good to discipline them. He thought it was good to teach them what they seem to have forgotten, and that is that our hope is in God, not in man. The deliverance from the trouble in this world is not through a new leader or through a new way of doing things or through a new program. The way of dealing with things is to turn to God, to listen to Him, to do what He would have us to do, and to live righteously and godly in the present age. That's the solution. But instead, they were turning to men. They were turning to governments. They were building their hopes on kings and on kings' armies and kings' chariots. They were thinking that their problems were going to go away if they just only had what the world has. And so God says, all right, if that's what you want, I'm going to give you exactly what you've asked for. But it's going to be for the purpose of teaching you. By the way, they didn't learn very well. Sometimes we don't either. Everything that we experience in life isn't going to be what we would call good. It isn't going to be easy. It isn't going to be fun. It isn't going to be pleasurable. It's not always going to be what we think is best. Sometimes what we think is best is actually not best. In this case, they wanted a king, and that was not what was best for them. God's going to give us things that we ask for. I think we can learn that from what's going on here. Our desire is important to Him. He doesn't always give us everything that we ask for. But even in this case, we just saw the people of God insisting on something that went against what he wanted, and he went ahead and gave it to them anyway. See, our desire is important. What we ask for matters. Sometimes, what we need to understand is what we get is not what's going to make life peaceful, not what's going to make righteousness reign in the world. It's not what's going to answer all the problems. Sometimes what we get is going to be disciplinary. When I was a child, my parents occasionally said to me, "You need to straighten up." And if I didn't, often the response was, "You're asking for it." They never did define it, but we all knew what they were talking about. And then occasionally I got it. I got what I was asking for by my behavior, maybe not by my mouth, because I promise you, when it was coming, I was saying, no. But I got it anyway. Sometimes I learned from it, sometimes I didn't. The fact of the matter is, sometimes what we get is what is disciplinary in nature, not something to make life easier in the short run. Something to give us to endure and to learn from. I want to leave you this morning with a passage from Hebrews chapter 12. Let's read together from Hebrews chapter 12, verses 7 through 11. I want you to listen to what the Hebrew writer says. And I want you to think about things. Think about life and think about how we approach things and think about where we place our hopes and where we place our confidence and where we turn for help. God professes to us that He's a very present help in time of need. Rarely do we turn to God for that help. Hebrews chapter 12, starting in verse 7, it says, "It is for discipline that you have to endure." The reason that we endure the things that go on in the world, the reason that we endure the circumstances we find ourselves in, the reason, it is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. He is giving us what we deserve. He is giving us what is good for us, not what we think is good. God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you're left without discipline, in which all have participated, then you're illegitimate children and not sons. Besides this, we've had earthly fathers who disciplined us and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time as it seemed best to them, but He disciplines us for our good, that we may share in His holiness. There is a point to the things that we must endure. There is a point to the things that He allows to happen. There is a point to the circumstances we find ourselves in. He disciplines us for our good, that we may share in His holiness. We're supposed to learn. We're supposed to wake up. We're supposed to recognize and turn and change. Listen, if there was injustice in the land, it wasn't because of Samuel's two sons. It was because the land was unjust. If they had all been walking in righteousness and doing the right thing, there wouldn't have been anything for them to judge. It was because the people were willing to make a bribe that the leaders could take bribes. It was because the people were willing to see injustice done to get their way. They needed a lesson. They needed to learn that their complaint about Samuel's 2 sons was really a complaint about themselves. That they needed to change. He disciplines us for our good that we may share in His holiness. We need to turn and start partaking in the holiness of God. Walk in the righteousness of God. Do what is right, no matter what the world is throwing at us, no matter what it looks like out there, no matter who has authority, who has control, it doesn't matter. I still have to walk in righteousness. I still have to share in His holiness. That's my duty. For the moment, all discipline seems to be painful rather than pleasant. But later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Okay, it may not be fun. It may not be what I want. It may not be what I like. It may be very unpleasant to me. Unpleasant to a degree that maybe we've never even fully appreciated. But afterwards, it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. If I keep my eyes open, if I learn from it, if I turn to doing the holiness of God, if I realize my missteps and my mistakes and the changes that I need to make in myself, and I am trained by it, peace will come. It may not come today, and it may not come tomorrow, and it may not come 10 years from now, but peace will come. It'll come from God. And it'll be eternal. It won't be a thing that is limited to a number of years on the earth. It will be eternal. Therefore, lift up your drooping hands. Strengthen your weak knees. Make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. Don't be damaged. Be strengthened. Don't be sad. Lift your countenance up. Raise up your drooping hands. Strengthen your weak knees. Make a straight path for yourself. Walk after God's holiness, after His righteousness. Put your confidence and faith in Him. And no matter what happens in this world, you will be at peace. Stephen exhibited peace while he was being stoned to death. He didn't plead with those who were casting stones at him to stop. He didn't say, it's not just. He turned to God. He put his confidence in God. He put his confidence in what God had in store for him. He even said not to hold this evil against him. That's a high standard, but it sets forth the peace that surpasseth understanding. It's the same peace that enabled Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to be cast into the fire without being unraveled by it. It's the same peace that allowed Daniel to go into the den without being unraveled by the lions. It's the same peace that allowed Paul to endure the circumstances that he endured in life without falling apart. It's the same peace that allowed Jesus to go to the cross and suffer the shame of the cross, looking toward the reward. Our lives are not controlled, are made better in those areas that are important, those lasting and eternal areas, those spiritual things, by the people around us, by the governments around us, or by any of those things. We're made righteous by God. We derive our hope from God. God doesn't make promises and then not deliver. I promise you, men do. God doesn't intend to do good and fall short of being able to accomplish it because they don't actually have the authority to do it. God fulfills His promises. God accomplishes the things that He sets out to do. God brings us to the place that He promised to bring us. And it doesn't matter how great the army is that's against us. If He promises victory, we gain the victory. And it doesn't matter how small it may seem. If He says to us, that will destroy you, that's what will happen. So we need to turn to Him, and we need to put our hope in Him, and we need to find confidence in Him and in His Word and rely upon that, because when we do, our peace doesn't ebb and flow with the tide of men. Our joy doesn't come and go with the daily satisfactions or disappointments. Our hope doesn't vanish because we didn't get our way. Our hope and our joy and our peace are founded upon Christ and upon the authority of God and His promises to us. And if we'll keep our eye upon those things, if we'll keep focused on those things, the kind of fretting and hand-wringing and crying and concerning that we've been watching for the last week will be foreign to us. We won't be there with them in consternation, worried about what may be or what has become, because we will know what is. Lessons yours for your consideration. I hope that I've said something